Hi and welcome to our Conan Fitness Platinum webinar for the month. We're looking at physical activity and nutrition for health and well-being, quite a general health term. What we're looking at is quite a few things that we've looked at before and kind of just putting them all together, bits and pieces from many of the other webinars we've done. And we're really looking at it from a lifestyle perspective. We're looking at the healthy lifestyle mixed with what we keep harping on about the warrior mindset, about knowing when to push, because there's times when you need to harden up and push a little harder, and there's times when you need to be smart and pull back, and knowing that difference for a healthy lifestyle as well as a productive one. And we're looking at health and wellness in all contexts. That means at the workplace, at home, in your community and physical activity endeavors, whatever you're doing, the whole lifestyle is one package. And like I said, putting it all together. We know that over the recent decades and even centuries, the trend away from a lifestyle of physical activity where we were constantly active just as part of our lifestyle once upon a time, and also the lifestyle of eating lean back in hunter-gatherer days when the only foods were foraging for roots, nuts, seeds, veggies, fruits, and obviously game, like killing animals to eat. And obviously none of it was really highly caloric dense, and certainly not fast foods like we have today. And in other words, that gap is widening, the gap between where we should be as a healthy lifestyle and the Western culture. Now that has some consequences with it. As we know, diets that are high in saturated fat, sugar, processed foods, salt, and those modern lifestyle tendencies or the cultural habits where need for physical activity is almost non-existent anymore. And the consequences are things like those diseases we know of: hypertension, obesity, diabetes. They're obviously on the rise. Many times they go undiagnosed. This graph shows, this is quite old actually, predictions of the population growth of the number percentage of the population with BMIs, that's the body mass index, above 30, which is classed as obese, predicting that the levels of increase up to the year 2030, and we're talking, over 50%. You look at blue, that's USA, getting close to 60%. The majority of the population obese, if we continue these health trends, which we all know about. But one of the interesting things is this research paper that came out. It was a British research paper some years now, that it was called the glutton versus the sloth. The glutton versus the sloth. And what it did is it said that we know that both diet and physical activity are both factors that we need to address because they're both bad. We need to make them better. But which may be the more dominating factor? What they found is that when they did the test, the clinical obesity had doubled in the past decade. But when they looked at decade upon decade, the average recorded energy intake of the population then, so the average caloric intake, decade on decade, certain decades increased, but some didn't. Certain ones, they decreased. Actually, the caloric intake, and it wasn't healthy foods, or wasn't great foods, but the total energy intake wasn't necessarily higher, yet they still had this increase in obesity. So the implication is that physical activity, or one's energy needs, may be at least as important as diet in the etiology of obesity, and maybe even the dominant factor. So interesting thing to note. When we look at the body as a whole, we've got an amazing specimen. We've got a skeleton that weighs, basically 3 or 4 kilos. It's a lightweight frame that's strong. We're talking pound for pound, it's as strong as granite. They say a piece of compact bone, if it were the size of a matchbox, would be able to hold 9 ton of compressive force. And we've got over 200 bones that are the framework for over 600 muscles. Just to take one step, the body uses over 200 muscles throughout the whole body, stabilizes the prime movers. And we take 10,000 steps in a day if we're physically active. We've got a cardiovascular system, a heart that beats over 100,000 times in a day. It's mind-boggling to think of that, but we just take it for granted. And it beats, your whole life. It pumps blood through over 60,000 miles worth of blood capillaries. That's more than twice around the world and it's mind-boggling. This amazing machine. We've got a brain that again weighs barely a couple of kilos. It's lightweight, but it has 100 billion neurons that sends nerve impulses at the speed of thought throughout the entire body, the entire nervous system. We've got an immune system that's working 24/7 right now. It's fighting bacteria and pathogens and fighting off disease, keeping you healthy, and most of the time we just take it for granted. As an organism, we got people that can do huge feats of performance, like speeds, sprinting speeds of 40k plus an hour, or endurance marathons of running 100 miles. That's 160 kilometers, running races on foot. It's mind-boggling that the humans can do this. Strength, they can lift 3, 4, and even 5 times their body weight, pure strength. So it kind of begs the question that if it's such a great organism and such vast potential, then why so much disease and ill health and poor performance? And generally that comes down to that whole quick fix notion. We're in a society where we just want the easy quick fix. It's built on convenience and it's built on short-term answers as opposed to addressing these issues that we talk about. So turning to physical activity, we know the benefits of physical activity are vast. We're coupling that with that mindset around making it a lifestyle factor, not just doing it because I should or doing it because I have to, but doing it because that's just your lifestyle and making that a priority. So here is the from the Department of Health, Australia's Physical Activity and Sedentary Behaviour Guidelines. And here they are, the guidelines. Be active on most, preferably all days of the week. Pretty simple. And we should be accumulating, so just cumulative, 150 to 300 minutes, so we're talking 2.5 to 5 hours, somewhere in that range, of moderate intensity physical activity. So, and that can be done in little blocks added up, or several big blocks, as long as it's cumulative, around that 2.5 to 5 hour mark. That's moderate intensity physical activity. Moderate meaning your heart rate's up and your breathing's up, but you could still probably talk and make a sentence. Or half that, meaning 75 minutes to 150 minutes of vigorous intensity physical activity, and that's where your heart rate's right up, you're breathless and you're panting, can barely talk well, or the equivalent combination of both. It says do muscle strengthening activities on at least 2 days each week. At least 2 days each week, and we'll see shortly why that's important. Minimize the amount of time spent in prolonged sitting and break up long sitting periods if you can, as often as possible. Really, we're talking about desk work there, the sedentary job. Obviously, that's a big factor these days that never used to be apparent back in hunter-gatherer days. You'd sit on a rock for 5 minutes and the rest of your day is on the move. That's physical activity. When it comes to nutrition, you've all seen this suggested eating pyramids or similar ones. You do get slightly different versions of this, but basically the ones we promote are the ones that says where veggies are the main, the majority of servings per day is veg. And that should be closely followed by fruit next, and also grains. So we're talking about the unprocessed healthy carbohydrates. And you see how in the past carbs have copped a bit of a bad rap, and we'll go into that in a minute, but how the source and the quality and that sort of thing makes a really big difference from it being a nice healthy nutrient and getting extra nutrients from those carbohydrate-based foods, to where it can be quite harmful or just lead to weight loss if it's poor sources and eaten in the wrong way. But from its natural perspective, it's really healthy nutrient, and it should be the next most amount of servings per day. Then we come to our lean meats, seafood, poultry, and even red meats, as well as our low-fat dairy, and then the things that you should eat least, like your oils and certainly the sweets to eat least. Here are our serving suggestions from the Australian Dietary Guidelines. This is the National Health and Medical Research Council putting this out. And you can see the servings of veg per day. You see there, men and women aged 19 to 50. That's kind of the majority of us here. You see that the serving is 6 for men, 5 for women, small for breastfeeding women. And you see that the servings of fruit per day is 2. So you've heard about your 5 and 2. And for men, that's at least 5 and 2. When we look at grains or cereal, now we know that some people have celiac disease, or they might be mildly gluten intolerant. They might have to change the sources of where they get their healthy carbs from, but at the end of the day, they still need the healthy carbs. And if you are not, then grains and cereals should provide the majority of that. And high fiber foods. You can see where 6 servings a day, and you can see on that pyramid what constitutes a serving. If you don't know, have a look on that. It's got the tips. That's grains. This is dairy and dairy alternatives. So again, some people are lactose intolerant. They might need some dairy alternatives, but there are lots of other nutrients other than just like calcium or things like that that you get from dairy, including your protein and things like that. We're looking at 2.5 serves a day. Now keep in mind with our grains there, the grains should be whole grains and ideally as unprocessed as possible. And dairy should be low fat. There aren't many people that need the high fat version. We're just kind of getting extra calories there. Other than maybe children and kids, they can do with the extra calories. It's often good, but certainly the majority of us, we don't need it. Now we're looking at lean meats, poultry. This includes poultry, fish, eggs, nuts, seeds, and legumes. So it includes all of that. We're looking at 2.5 to 3 servings, and this is per day. So it's not saying 3 servings of lean red meat per day. It's saying 3 servings of all those things. You'd probably be looking at 2 to 3 servings of lean meat, red meat per week. But with all those other things, it gives you an idea. And certainly we should be choosing the lean meats, yeah. So the lower fat options. If you can get lots of meat and things like that are high in saturated fat, and you obviously want to be steering clear of that. So the main tips, we know about the 5 and 2, that's veg and fruit, your low-fat dairies, your unprocessed grains, your meat and fish, and just the things like limiting intake of foods that are high in saturated fat and sugar, things like biscuits and cakes and pastries, pies, processed meats, your burgers and pizzas and fried foods and stuff, and trying to replace high-fat foods which contain predominantly saturated fats, like butters and creams and cooking margarine and stuff, with foods that contain mostly poly and monounsaturated fats. So things like oils, spreads, nut butters, or pastes, and things like avocado. And obviously limit the sugar, the confectionery, sugar-sweetened drinks, cordials, things like that, and increase fiber and water. Now we mentioned about carbohydrates getting a bad rap. One of the things to note is where the source of the carbohydrate is, like how much processing and cooking has it been through, or how it's cooked, and what it's served with, because that can make a big difference. If it's served with, you think of potato chips, and people say potato chips are bad for you because of the potato. It's carbohydrates, and that's completely false. Potatoes themselves are great. Potato chips are bad is because you're eating that processed carbohydrate, which is laden with oil, and it's that combination that makes it a lot better. It's usually the crappy type of oil. Carbohydrates themselves are the preferred energy source for the body, and particularly the brain. I mean, the brain can only really use glucose. That's blood sugar, that blood carbohydrate. It doesn't use fat very well as an energy source, only in an incomplete way. So there's different types of carbohydrates. We've got sugars, that's your basic type. Fibrous, they're your like veggies and fibrous type of carbohydrates, and starchy carbs like your pastas, rices, breads, and things like that. Fiber also is a type of carbohydrate. It should be classed as 0 calories if it's proper fiber, because it should pass through you. High glucose, here's the thing to note, that high glucose, they're your really sugary types of foods. Glucose is your blood sugar. And when that goes up and you've got high glucose, you have a high insulin effect. Now, when we talk about diabetes, that's it. It's just the insulin that's the problem, because we're talking type 2 here. When insulin has been secreted too high, too often, too long, for too long, too often, then the body becomes resistant to that insulin effect. And that's diabetes right there. That's classic, typical type 2 diabetes, or at least a precursor to it. So we don't want to put those high glucose, the carbohydrates like the sugars, which elicit high glucose too much too often. It's the lower GI, you've heard of glycemic index, that keeps the blood sugar low and consistent. Now, if you have too low carbs, so not enough, then you get lethargy, mood swings, low muscle synthesis. Muscle needs the glucose, the glycogen, to get the energy, the carbohydrates to function and to grow and use it as energy. And you can even get low sexual drive. Like we said, it's commonly said that carbs are the energy, but it's more dependent on, think about the individual. Like if someone has a high amount of physical activity, then they certainly need more carbohydrates. And granted, if someone's a couch potato, then they don't need as much. They just don't. They still need their healthy carbs, but they certainly don't need anywhere in the vicinity that someone who's highly physically active. And then when it comes to training and physical activity, the quality and the quantity and the timing of those carbs becomes important. As far as one's caloric intake for the day, carbohydrates should comprise the largest contributor to that, with fats and protein being next. If you think of protein, when you think of the body being mostly water, the rest of most of the dry weight is protein. Protein is just a bunch of building blocks called amino acids. Some are essential and non-essential. Essential doesn't mean you need it, because you also need the non-essential ones. It just means you need to eat it, because the body can make the non-essential ones if it's provided the essentials. As far as functions go, it's got heaps of things, mostly around growth and repair, but it's also the building blocks of things like nails, hair, skin, enzymes, hormones. And one of the big things is muscle, because amino acids are the basic building block of, or proteins, the basic building block of our muscles. When it comes to fats, there's different types. There's the saturated, that's the not so great type. The monounsaturated and polyunsaturated, we want to get a bit more of. And trans fats, there you don't hear much about it, because we shouldn't hear much about it. They're the real unnatural ones. They're almost like man-made, lab-made, and we kind of want to steer clear of those. Here are some of our essential fatty acids. And there are related diseases to insufficient essential fatty acids, as in not enough fat. So while we don't want too much of it, we also need enough of our healthy fats for optimal functioning. And if we don't get enough, there are ill effects on weight loss as well. So we don't want too much, because you put on weight, and too little, things like not having improved levels of testosterone. And it's also, when it says energy synthesis and usage, fat is the next most preferred energy source for the body. Here's an analogy we use when it comes to pretty much any nutrient. If you were to think of your protein, that's the amino acids in the body, or maybe glycogen, that's the stored energy in your body, or fat, even things like bone, like literal bone deposits. Think of it like a sink full of water. That's, let's say, half full of water, and a tap that when you turn it on, it's obviously adding water to the sink, and there's the sinkhole that constantly kind of drips, that lets water out. And the question is that the overall rate of water coming into the sink versus the rate where it exits, what's more? Because it's got this constant turnover, there's constantly water coming in, there's constantly water going out, so the water level stays fairly stagnant unless intake outweighs the rate at which water leaves the sink. And that's a great analogy for, let's say, protein turnover in the body. There's this constant turnover. You're constantly breaking down protein in the body, and you're also constantly building it up. So the question is, which one will happen at a greater rate? What's the net effect? Is the net effect a decrease, or a net effect an increase in the rise of the water? Or let's say it's fat and you want to decrease it. Constant energy coming in, energy going out, or let's say fat coming into the body, fat being built up and fat being broken down throughout the whole day. Fat's being broken down in your body, but you're also building up fat stores every time you eat or consume a meal, and that's normal, that's natural. We just want to make sure that the overall rate is slightly greater breakdown than build up if you're aiming to lose weight from fat. So it's a good analogy with the constant turnover of nutrients, and how we want to constantly supply the good nutrients that we know are constantly being broken down, and try not to supply too much of the ones that we know are continually building up. That brings us to food processing, because processing is basically the transforming of raw ingredients or food into certain foods or other forms, and it typically takes the clean harvested crop or animal products, and it uses them to make some sort of produce that's like attractive and marketable, and often something with a long shelf life. So because it's kind of built on convenience these days, things in boxes or bags or something that can sit on a shelf. The consequence of that, some of the consequences of processing and convenience-based foods is that you do get a little bit of nutrient loss. So we're losing some of the good nutrients, and we're getting some of the additives, the things that they're throwing into it to keep it say, the shelf life, or to be able to sit in a box or a bag. Now, we kind of couple this with our lifestyle factors that are heavily based on generational and cultural habits. So when you think of generational, something that's passed down from parent to child and then those people to their children, it's often habit-based or cultural-based, or within a community or a culture, where they get their foods from, their typical diet. It's pretty ingrained. So some of the times we're trying to break cultural habits, or particularly generational habits, within the home. So you often find that, let's say if the parents are overweight, often the children might end off that way just because of habits that are learned in the household, and sometimes that's hard to break. If they're typically used to buying and consuming processed foods out of convenience or whatever it might be, then that might be typical for the children to pick up and just carry through. So one of the things we do see a lot is poor habits that are passed down, if you will. And that brings us to weight control, because as I was saying, you might get, say, some overweight parents, and it's really easy for the children to follow in those footsteps. It's quite hard to break. So when it comes to weight control, we want to think about the basis of it. And what we mean that is, here's our skeleton. And when we're talking about weight control, what are we talking about? Well, we're not talking about changing the skeleton, because there it is. That doesn't change. And we know that that's not necessarily the shape of the body that we know. This is layering the muscle. So that was the skeleton. This is the muscular system layered on top. And our organs are pretty much within that, within the rib cage and within the abdominal cavity, the majority of them anyway. And the musculature provides the shape of the body that we know. So when you think of the shape, if you were to look at a silhouette of that, that's the body that you know. This diagram has exactly that, the skeleton plus the muscle, but what we've included on top of that is 3 different versions of amounts of body fat. So this is meant to be a depiction of the same skeleton, so it looks like one's broader than the other one. It's not. With a very similar muscle mass, but extra body fat. And you can see how the shape changes, and it looks like a totally different body shape, but what we're really talking about is changes in fat mass, body fat, because our skeleton doesn't change. Things like water and organs, they shouldn't change that much. The only things that change in body composition is muscle and fat, really, and the one that changes the most is fat. So that's what we're looking at and what we're talking about in weight control, particularly weight loss, which is so common. And the basis for it, as we know, is the difference between calories in and calories out, or energy in and energy out. When talking about the total amount of energy that comes in, there's only 4 sources. You can eat all the vitamins, minerals, and consume all the fiber and water you want, but they don't have calories in it. Things that have calories is carbohydrates, protein, and fat, and macronutrients, and also alcohol. We have to count that because that does provide calories. In fact, it's second only to fat. Carbohydrates and protein both have about 4 calories for every gram, and fat has over double that. And you can see that alcohol is not far behind. When it comes to calories out, as in the amount of calories you burn in a day, it mostly comes from our basal metabolic rate, or your resting metabolic rate, which is how much energy you consume just staying alive, just idling, a car idling, if you will. Obviously, exercise increases that, and that's added on top. And then what we call daily activities. So if you were to imagine just lying completely at rest, that's basal metabolism. Daily activities is anything above that that's not really classed as exercise. So things like if you were to, cook or brush your teeth or do your homework or just whatever your daily activities are, that's over and above basal metabolism, and it's added on top. And altogether, those things make your total daily energy expenditure, your TDEE. So here is a list of some of the factors that affect basal metabolism. As I said, that basal metabolism constitutes the majority of the calories you burn in a day. And for weight management, if you're looking to increase out, as in increase the amount of calories you burn out, then you want to have a high healthy basal metabolism. And here's a bunch of factors, and I've boldened the one that says lean body mass, as in that's the one we want to look at, because it's one of the factors that we can have at least a little bit of control on. Certain things like race and genetics you're not going to have a huge amount of control on. But it's also one of the things where we spoke about before. When we were looking at the guidelines of physical activity, we said we wanted to include resistance work throughout the week, as well as our several hours of cumulative exercise. And here's why. They did a study, or they've done several, where they look at 3 protocols for weight loss. One is diet alone. The second is exercise alone. And the third is diet and exercise together. Now, when they're just looking at weight alone, weight loss, as in just weight loss, not looking at any more specifics, the one that got the greatest amount of weight loss, surprisingly, was just diet alone. You might think diet and exercise, but just weight. But what they found when they look at the data in a little bit more detail is that a great proportion of that, when it was just dieting, was muscle mass, lean body mass. And that's the good stuff. Remember, we want to lose fat, not healthy tissue, because if you decrease your lean body mass, that's your muscle tissue, then you decrease your basal metabolism and make it harder to lose weight later on. So when they look at it from that perspective, then the protocol that got the best weight loss as far as fat loss, that was diet and exercise, because the exercise was able to retain the lean body mass more. So that says why not just diet alone, and it also says why not to do just cardio alone. We do want to do our cardiovascular exercise, our aerobic stuff, but not alone. We want the resistance work to keep and ideally build our healthy muscle tissue. So here's a quick diagrammatic view of weight, the basis of weight control. We know, as an example, if someone wants to eat 3,000 calories intake, output 3,000 calories, then there's no change in body weight because there's a net result of 0. If they intake 4,000 and only burn 2,000, then that's weight gain. And obviously, if they only ate 2,000 but burnt up 3,000, then they decrease body weight. So when you hear people say, oh, I've been trying this or I've been doing that, but I just can't get the weight off, then let's look at this and say, well, where might the extra calories be coming in from? Where are they coming in from? Because we know that if weight's not changing, this equation is equaling out. Or maybe it's, where can we get extra caloric expenditure from? What opportunities can we use to burn up more? And if we look at it from that perspective, it does simplify the situation a bit. If we look at fat versus muscle, have a look on the right there where it says, this is talking about there being 3,500 calories in a pound of fat. But look at it per kilogram, or rather work in kilograms. 7,700 calories for every kilogram of fat. That says if you were to lose 1,100 calories a day, that means a deficit, right? So let's say you burnt 3,100 and ate 2,000. That's an 1,100 calorie difference. And you did that every day for a week. That's 7,700 calories deficit in a week. That then you'd be looking at about a kilo of fat, and that's not easy to do. If we look at muscle has much less energy in it, but it can be used for energy. It's 600 calories per pound. That's 1,320, so 1,320 calories per kilogram, much, much less. So if we were to do that same thing, if we lost 7,700 calories, would it be a kilo? Well, the answer is, if it was purely fat, yes, but that's very rare. If it were just muscle, then 7,700 calories would work out to 5.8 kilograms of muscle, because there's less energy in each kilogram of muscle. Now, someone looking at the scales might think, fantastic, look at that, lost 5.8 kilos. That's so much better than 1 kilo. But remember, that's not a great situation, because that's just lost 5.8 kilos of the good stuff and hasn't lost much of the bad stuff. And that just means it's going to lower the basal metabolism and make it harder to continue weight loss later on. So now let's look at putting it all together and making a work-life balance as well as a life balance with your exercise and your other certain things. Putting it all together, does this, whatever you're aiming to do, realistically fit into your schedule? Are you able to prioritize first? What are the things that are most important to you? What counts the most? Things like family or work commitments or whatever it might be, and your exercise and health, and then factor other things around that. Things to consider: your goal, work, family, whatever your other commitments are, and obviously you time, and then schedule it. So it might look something like this. Remember, we said we want, let's say, 3 hours of cumulative exercise. You might say, I'm going to book 6 half-hour blocks into my schedule and block it out. I might say, I'm going to do 3 one-hour blocks or something like that. So long as you are able to fit that in and make it realistic and something you can do consistently, so long as you're able to adhere to it. Now, do keep in mind incidental exercise. So this is the wanky term is NEAT exercise, or non-exercise activity thermogenesis, which just means you're burning extra calories out of activity that isn't necessarily classed as exercise. So basically anything that's physical or is activity, but not really structured or organized enough to class as regular exercise. But it does add up. So you look at things like this: walking the dog, or getting off one bus stop early and walking the rest of the way, or taking the stairs instead of the escalator. Things like that, they do add up. So you can, it's not classed as your formal exercise, but it can be a good way to add into, because everything adds up, into increasing your physical activity in your day. So just some extra tips around physical activity. Tips around diet. We've looked at these factors before when we spoke with Chris, our nutritionist, and things like planning your meals or including your family when you plan those meals, allocating certain meals per week. So it might be, allocating certain days for eating your meats or your fishes, or how you're going to get in your veg and your fruit. Practical tips on shopping, like don't shop hungry, because it'll literally affect what you put in your shopping trolley. Remember, Chris was telling us shop around the outside of the food aisle, the shopping centre, because the aisles in the middle is typically where all the convenience and processed stuff is, where typically on the outside of the shopping centre, around the shop, is where your fresher produce is, and that's certainly what you want to eat more. When it comes to eating the nutrient-dense way, we want foods that are nutrient-dense but calorie-sparse. So that means lots of food but little calories. Whereas foods like this is small foods that have heaps of calories, and that's the sort of stuff you want to keep away from. When it comes to proportions and meal portion sizes, we want small portion sizes, but here's how the proportional makeup of a typical plate or meal should look. So when someone says, hey, I thought pasta wasn't so great for me, well, pasta itself is excellent. It's just that if someone was to have some processed pasta as opposed to wholemeal, and they have it in some really oily sauce, some fatty sauce, and they have their whole bowl of pasta with nothing else, then that's when it becomes that's the downfall. They have a whole bowl and that's the meal. There's no veggies, there's no salads, no fruit or protein or anything, other than maybe a little bit of protein in their bolognese mince or whatever it might be. But that's where the downfall is. If it was just a side corner portion, like a quarter of the plate of healthy wholemeal pasta with some lean sauce, then it's fantastic. So here's the tips on putting it all together. Remembering that we're making it a lifestyle factor, and that's the thing. If it's lifestyle, you'll be able to consistently do it forever. So looking at physical activity and nutrition, putting it all together, make it a lifestyle. I hope that helps. If there are any questions, send them through to us at info@conanfitness.com. We'd love to hear your feedback. And until next time, work hard, play smart, and bring out the warrior within.